So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today. We're still having some more participants join, so I might wait for another minute or so before we actually start. But yeah, the numbers are still going up, so we'll just wait a minute. Okay, I think we're good to start now. So thank you everyone for attending. I'm Narelle Howarth from the Centre for Accident Research and Road Safety Queensland, and I'll facilitate today in my role as Vice President Policy of the ACRS. The webinar will examine opportunities in the National Road Safety Strategy 2021 to 2030, that it provides for all sectors to contribute to achieving the targets of reducing the number of fatalities by 50% and the number of serious injuries by 30% by 2030. The strategy was released in December last year. It sets out Australia's road safety objectives over the next decade. The accompanying National Road Safety Plan is still being formulated. We are promised that it will prioritise those national actions which will contribute most strongly to achieving the targets and set in place comprehensive performance management strategies, including safety performance indicators, to measure the extent of transformation of the road transport system. Just some housekeeping. Our webinar will be 60 minutes long. It will be recorded and emailed to all registrants. We'll leave questions until the end of the webinar. Please post your questions in the Q&A and we'll address as many as possible after the presenters have finished. Today, we have 6 presenters from very different sectors whose work contributes to road safety. They'll each speak for 5 minutes on the opportunities that they see in the new strategy. Our first speaker is David McTiernan, National Leader Transport Safety, Infrastructure Safety Performance at ARRB. The floor is yours, David.
Thanks, Narelle. And thanks for the opportunity to give a brief outline as I see the opportunities for particularly the road engineering and road infrastructure managers that the new strategy provides. So I think if we, Gemma, if we go to the next slide, the strategy for 2021-2030 has made several key changes compared to the previous strategy, and perhaps they reflect the evolution of the safe system approach thinking and the experience that we've gained over the last 10 years throughout the previous strategy as to how road safety can be best applied to prevent death and serious injury. So just looking here on this slide, the most obvious features of it is that it's adopted the social model to inform how the strategy delivers across different layers of action of government and the community and organisations. to achieve that zero death and serious injury vision. The social model also offers that big picture context for the strategy of what it's working in. So it's no longer just about road safety and road infrastructure, it's how that relates to a much broader aspect of the community and governance. And I think for me as an engineer, that opens up a much broader context to be working in and to be thinking about. And a key part of that, I think, is the placement of movement and place directly within the strategy, providing that context for how we think about road infrastructure. So importantly, movement and place puts people at the centre of thinking and decision-making for road infrastructure. And as engineers, we really need to plan, deliver and manage road infrastructure with road function in mind, matched to those road users. And you could always argue that's what we should always have been doing, but to have it embedded in the strategy really makes it front and centre for us to think about. There's always going to be roads that serve to move people and goods from A to B, such as those that are managed by Transurban, for example, that Liz Waller will talk about later. But those roads are much less about vulnerable road users and cyclists and more about throughput. So vehicle speed and volume and how that infrastructure needs to be designed and managed accordingly to deliver safety is what that does for that end of that movement place spectrum. At the other end, there are the streets where we live, where we gather as communities, mostly as individuals and pedestrians and cyclists. So we need to think more about how the road infrastructure provides a low speed environment and is virtually a vehicle excluded environment, if not vehicles certainly being a second class of the road feature. So this part of the strategy really provides some solid points for discussion and consideration as engineers, a bit of a framework for us to think about. So Jim, if we just go to the next slide, please. For me, the strategy is providing some very clear areas of priority for the engineering area. So I've just highlighted some there in red. So planning investment, and in a large country such as Australia with a scattered population, it's great to see regional roads gain a specific, clear priority focus. And along with that, the remote roads. So we have a lot of regional areas in Australia, and then we have what we would class as remote areas. And those roads and the communities out there present specific challenges for road engineers with a certain constrained budget. How do we make sure the road infrastructure supports the delivery of safety and the prevention of death and serious injury? Heavy vehicles, which were a feature of the last strategy, and I think in a country like Australia where heavy vehicles serve such a large part of the freight movement component of our road network, it's very important that is looked at. And just going to the last slide, please, Gemma. I think we really need to understand as engineers some of these enabling actions. And for me, importantly, it's about data and research, measurement and transformation, and how we go about that. And so network safety plans, network risk assessments are really key to that. And as a former local government engineer, I've been with ARRB for 15 years now, but my roots are in local government. It's really encouraging to see that the strategy supports local government and building capacity, building their expertise, their skills and their ability to deliver road safety. So I think it'll be interesting to see what comes up, Narelle, in the Q&A session. I'm happy to contribute there.
Thank you, David. David mentioned the increased role of local government in road safety in the strategy. Our next speaker can give us a hands-on perspective. She's Jo Wilson-Ridley, a road safety officer from Queanbeyan-Palerang Regional Council.
Thanks, Narelle. From today, we have 3,209 days until we reach the end of 2030. The National Road Safety Strategy has the goal that in 3,209 days, it will reduce the number of people killed on roads by 50% and the number of people severely injured by 30%. For local government that work directly with our communities, this is an exciting goal as we see road trauma impacting our communities personally. The trauma reduction targets the community will want to hear about, but they will also want to see action happening. Working in local government, I speak with local residents daily. They contact council concerned about dangerous locations on our local roads. They might have had a near miss, or they might have seen a crash, or they've identified how part of the road is being used dangerously. And the dialogue that we have with residents is that they will say, I don't want someone to be killed or seriously injured here. Previously, and still some funding models supporting local government to improve safety favoured benefit cost ratios, business cases where there had been fatalities. This meant that as a local government, we were forced to have really difficult conversations with our communities. They would say, does someone have to die here before you do something? And our answer of how we were funded and supported was yes. The adoption of the Safe Systems approach acknowledged that the answer of yes was unacceptable, but systems and strategies have not previously been in place to acknowledge that the next question local government and residents were forced to ask was also unacceptable. And that question was who? Who in our community or our visitor to our local government area had to die before safety is addressed? The exciting development in the National Road Safety Strategy is that it acknowledges that the who conversations with our communities are unacceptable, and it identifies that we need to transform how we approach road safety. We need to move to proactively manage safety for everyone that travels our local roads. And David is correct that the new National Road Safety Strategy has identified a larger role for local government with new enabling action plans like the network safety plans. The strategy also acknowledges the need for federal and state government to enhance their support for local government so that we can embed road safety into our core businesses. And that's an exciting development for local government. I, for one, am looking forward to working on this goal with my federal and state partners. There's 537 local councils in Australia, and of this, 55% are regional, rural and remote councils. Two of the identified priorities in the strategy are regional road safety and remote road safety, and these are also exciting opportunities for local government. Local government manage 75% of Australia's roads by length, so we have a large and key role to play. A couple of weeks ago, there was a head-on fatality crash on one of my more remote regional roads, and I heard from the residents living on that road travelling it daily. They had just lost a friend from their community. They described their road as a gravel road with a default speed limit. Other sections, it was sealed, undivided, 100 kilometres an hour. And their main concern was speed, that the 100 kilometres didn't seem correct for the road conditions, and that the head-on crash and loss of their friend seemed inevitable. And they didn't want to see anyone else die on the road. The National Road Safety Strategy features actions in regional and remote road safety to develop a regulation impact statement on reducing the open road default speed limit. And this could transform in our regional and remote areas how they travel, how fast they travel, to how safe they travel. As local government, this is an exciting action in the strategy, and we have the ability to bring the voices and concerns of our local residents to the table for this important discussion. Local councils are the tier of government that work closely and directly with residents, and we have the connections and experiences of working broadly with our communities. The use of the social model in the national strategy to move road safety from just working in the transport industry and operating more broadly across community, organisations and businesses will need local government playing a key role. We already have experience working broadly, and it's likely that we'll lead the way in this part of the strategy. This is the first national road safety strategy to identify such a large role for local government, and we're looking forward to seeing action for our communities. Narelle.
Thank you, Jo. I'd like to give an apology, and I'd like to apologise that I did neglect to provide an acknowledgement to country when we first started. Certainly, road safety is a very important issue for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and they have an important role to play in road safety. We acknowledge and respect their elders, past, present and future, and hope that we can all work together as the Australasian College of Road Safety to improving safety, particularly for their groups. Jo mentioned the social model, something that is new to many people in road safety. Our next speaker can provide more background on this. He is Professor Richard Franklin, Professor in Public Health and Director of the World Safety Organisation Collaborating Centre on Injury Prevention and Safety Promotion at James Cook University.
Thanks, Narelle, and good afternoon, everybody that is listening in. I'd just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm on, which is the Bindul and Wurraraba people land, and acknowledge their elders, current and emerging, and thank them for their custodianship of the land. Also say Wadamuli to you, which is welcome in the local Bindagubba language. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge all the people that lose their lives or are impacted by road traffic incidents every year. And part of what I want to talk about is obviously the role that health plays, and thinking a little bit more about this social ecological or social model, as we call it in the plan, around why we're doing it from a health perspective and where we come to it. Now, the systems-based stuff is actually really important, and we use a lot of systems when we start to think through kind of the health systems, because one of the things from health is that we're often impacted by incidents such as road traffic fatalities or drowning or other sorts of incidents, but it's not actually health that has the wherefore, i.e. the infrastructure or the money to go out and prevent these sorts of things. So we often need to work with others. Hence, we take kind of a systems-based approach as we start to think through who needs to be involved and how do we actually engage them, and how do we work with the leaders in those space to then kind of think through what needs to be done. So this social model, which I've got to say I really quite like, and I think it's good to see this in the plan, gets us thinking a little bit more widely than just the infrastructure. And it's been really good to hear the last two speakers also acknowledge kind of people and the role that they play. We have some wonderful engineering that goes on around roads and what they do. But if I just put on my rural and remote hat for a moment, we often don't think about what the people in the community want from their roads. So we often talk about moving roads out of towns and out to the outside and have departures from that and bypasses, etc. But often when you talk to those towns, they actually want the traffic to flow through the town. They want people to stop and have benefit from those people that are traveling in those areas. So there's this kind of conflict with what we know is useful, i.e. moving that traffic to somewhere else, as opposed to what people might want, the traffic coming through, stopping, spending money in their towns. So this kind of challenge as we start to think about community approach that goes into it is thinking about what do we want from a community approach and the way that it works. The last two speakers have also talked about rural and remote areas, and it's great to see that that's had a greater focus in the plan. I think, looking through the plan, one of the things that heartens me is that we're talking also about local councils, but we're also talking about capacity building. And we've got a real challenge in rural and remote areas because often, and I'm talking about them at the moment, kind of saying rural and remote, but they're really not homogenous. There are individual groups as you go through that have individual needs that are going to have to, from an organisational, a local level, deal with these kind of challenges that they face in the road safety space. And it may be, one town just down the road from another have totally different needs. So we're going to have to work with councils and work through these kind of challenges, but also the skill base and access to information as part of it. One of my bugbears, and you'll hear me go on about this around rural and remote road safety, is we talk about it. We know there's a problem. We've got pretty good epidemiological data that now shows as you go more remotely, there's particular issues. But it's often tacked on to other studies, and we often don't get a large enough sample size because you often got to oversample from a research perspective to get the evidence that something actually works in that rural and remote area. So we know a lot of strategies work well in metropolitan areas, but we don't actually know whether they transfer well into local areas. And this kind of goes to some of the things like to the transportation within the area. So for example, a lack of buses, a lack of taxis, a lack of other ways of getting around. So people rely heavily on motor vehicles to move in rural areas, but also goes to enforcement as well. So again, the police do a great job, but there might be only one police officer in town. And I know, having lived in a number of rural towns, that when the police officer's are busy off doing something else, people know that they can unfortunately drink, drive, or do other sorts of things. So there's some real challenges as we kind of work through, but the plan is really great in that it's picked up on some of these things and some of the interpersonal kind of issues around it. I think the other thing that we've got to think about is not just the immediate impact, so obviously the deaths and people that are hospitalised, but also the ongoing impact of some of these issues that we see. So GPs seeing people for pain, anxiety, PTSD, depression, sleep disorders, medication-related issues. We've also got issues from a health perspective about people being able to respond and get to incidents as well. So we do need to make sure we can do that. And then we've got these as I said, in rural and remote areas, these real challenges around heavy vehicles, which we've kind of starting to address. We've got issues around motorcycles, quad bikes, pedestrians, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders. So great to see that we're starting to talk about this. And I think the thing for me, which we need to see from the plan, is that we've got a nice really structure for us, but how do we then operationalise that down to a local level, and how do we help engage, have a leadership role in this sort of space and bring people along so that at that local level, local council can actually manage to do things, but also those other partners that we would need to bring in to make a big difference and reduce by 50% those deaths and injuries from road traffic fatalities. Thanks very much, Narelle. I look forward to chatting more about some of the questions that are coming through.
Yes, I certainly would encourage everyone to put their questions into the question and answer box, and we'll come to those later. Our next speaker is Sean Leonard. He's the chair of the Australian Motorcycle Council. He'll discuss the opportunities that the strategy provides for improving motorcycle safety.
Thank you so much, Narelle, and thank you for all the participants being here today. So in the world of motorcycling, I actually want to go back over some context of the past 10 years, but it is important and relevant to what I then want to say about where we sit at the start of the current decade. Now, in 2010, there were 661,000 registered motorcycles in Australia. Over the decade to 2020, that increased by 33% to 881,000. But over that time, the raw motorcycle fatality number remained fairly constant. In fact, it did trend downwards. So looking at the fatality rate, in 2010, it was 3.4 per 10,000 motorcycle registrations. In 2010, it was 2.2 per 10,000 registrations. So over that decade, have achieved a 35% decrease in the fatality rate. In fact, by comparison, go back 30 years to 1990, fatality rate for motorcycles was 8.6 per 10,000 registrations, almost 4 times what it currently is. Now, why I've touched on that is there's been a prevailing view in some sectors of road safety, over the last 10, 20 years, that things would be better, and I put that word in inverted commas, if there were less motorcycles on the road. But the next National Road Safety Strategy provides the opportunity to move beyond that means of thinking. And with almost 900,000 powered two-wheelers or motorcycles in Australia now, it's well past the time to sort of get that prevailing view. And it's important to work with motorcycle organisations as a separate and legitimate part of the transport mix moving into the future. And the social model of the National Road Safety Strategy, to our mind, certainly emphasises that. Now, in terms of motorcyclists as one of the vulnerable road user aspects, I guess we see that another opportunity is that there's been probably a focus on cyclists and pedestrians within the vulnerable road user category, but not always sort of a recognition of this growing number of motorcycles on the roads in Australia. An example of how that's changed, though, in terms of infrastructure, and many of you listening today will be familiar with this, is that with IRAT now having a separate categorisation for assessing roads and infrastructure for their safety for motorcyclists. But across the country, things are still very ad hoc, and the actual application of the safe system approach for motorcycle safety does have a long way to go. The new strategy makes a number of infrastructure references, and one of the quotes that talks about infrastructure treatments are to be for the protection of all vulnerable road users. And yet we're still seeing, as an example, we see rollouts of new cycling infrastructure using non-frangible posts, which in fact not only pose a hazard to motorcycles, but in fact the very cyclists that the new infrastructure is designed to protect. The strategy also talks about touring routes, and there's a comprehensive Austroads guide published in 2016. That's now 6 years ago, talking about how to build roads and new roads and how to improve roads for the safety of motorcyclists, but its application is still very ad hoc. So over the forthcoming decade, where the strategy talks about motorcycle touring routes, there is a real opportunity to bring about system changes to how infrastructure is built for motorcycles. I just want to touch on the gig economy as well, which is one element that's highlighted in the new strategy. So in terms of gig economy, again, it goes back to sort of this increasing, not only motorcycles, but electric bikes, e-bikes are becoming more and more prevalent on the road too. So rather than just saying simply, this is bad, what can we do about this? The question should be going forward is, how can we enable the gig economy riders to do their work in our economy and in where we live safely? A couple of the previous speakers have already spoken about the local government, so I won't sort of say much about that, other than that clearly the rural and regional roads, do sort of pose the hazard to motorcycle riders, and the maintenance questions and the money for the volumes of traffic. So we're looking forward to there being this sort of greater focus on rural and regional roads in the coming decade. In terms of the cultural change, I'll just touch on the social model again. So certainly our organisation and the other organisations we represent across the states and territories are very much wanting to work with the authorities, but working with the riders that we represent as a part of progressing motorcycling and power two-wheel use as a safer part of the overall transport mix. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Enforcement has traditionally played a major role in road safety policies and practices in Australia. Nick Timms is a road safety advisor at RTS Zero and a retired New South Wales police officer. He'll now outline the opportunities he sees in the strategy for policing and other enforcement activities.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Narelle. So when I talk about enforcement, I will be including references to other agencies, people that have authorised officers. So from the get-go in the strategy on page 1, ministers have signed off on building institutional capacity, stronger governance and accountability. If you were writing a set of police operational orders, this would be the commander's intent. This is a ministerial directive to ensure enforcement is match fit to deliver road safety. The national strategy, as well as jurisdictional plans, must be reflected by enforcement. Adopt the 2030 targets in corporate plans and performance agreements. Police and other enforcement officers should not be killed or seriously injured on duty. Setting targets for duty-related crashes will reduce workers' comp premiums, reduce time lost to injury, and reduce vehicle repair costs. The concept of movement and place may be new to enforcement practitioners, but speed management certainly isn't. Ethical and high visibility road policing will be pivotal in delivering road safety outcomes, the outcomes that are described on page 13 of the strategy. Delivering speed enforcement requires the strengthening of management functions. Again, this involves being match fit to deliver a mix of face-to-face intercepts and camera detection. Hopefully, we are at the stage where road policing resources are no longer being diverted to pandemic-related duties. But doing the job requires an understanding of the impacts of speed in a crash. Once you get out of your patrol car, you become vulnerable road users. Enforcement operates on foot, on bicycles, on motorcycles, on horses, and no doubt within this decade, on new micro-mobility devices. Ensure your operations are not exposing people to forces the human body can't withstand. Speed management works with safe roads, safe vehicles, and safe road use to provide layers of protection known as the safe system. Police may say, well, there's nothing we can do about safe roads, but there is. Police are well respected within their local communities. They provide advice to local government and sit on local traffic committees. Teach movement in place and safe systems in highway patrol courses. Provide the best possible advice and road safety advocacy to your community. Also, enforcement agencies must provide the safest possible vehicles, which, when on-sold, will increase the safety of the used vehicle fleet. In regards to your motorcycle riders, utilise the MotoCap testing procedures to purchase the most safest possible garments. The social model presents an opportunity for enforcement to leverage existing community partnerships. Use stakeholder managers to influence behaviour and save lives on the road. Road safety, after all, is everyone's responsibility. I also invite organisations who support first responders to embrace the strategy. Police associations and other emergency services unions, police banks and superannuation providers. You too can help bring about cultural change to your members and their families, hundreds of thousands of people. It was a coalition of unions, hospitals and other groups that helped bring about a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit in New York City, supported by school zone speed cameras. I make special mention of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, who fund initiatives like the Health in Gear program by AusHelp to support the health and wellbeing of truck drivers. Hopefully AusHelp's paper will be selected for conference this year so you can learn more. Note those 9 priorities of the strategy. The upcoming action plan will focus on these priority areas. Start thinking now how enforcement can integrate these priorities into daily taskings. There are existing examples from New South Wales. Operation Puma that targets risky road use, and the level crossing awareness and enforcement campaign for regional road use. This is a government strategy. Use it as leverage for additional resources. For example, how about Aboriginal community liaison officers trained in road safety? Finally, this strategy is in step with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. New Zealand Police are now testing plug-in hybrids to see if they are suitable for operational duties. The goal of New Zealand Police is to reduce their carbon footprint, but budgets are under pressure from rising fuel costs and enforcement activities will be under threat. Use this strategy to underpin your enforcement operations whilst incorporating sustainability and efficiency into your road safety business as usual. We must all believe that death and serious injuries on our roads are unacceptable. Thanks, Narelle.
Sorry, thank you, Mick. That was certainly a very broad-ranging perspective of the roles that enforcement can play that we need to remember. Our last speaker brings an industry perspective on what the strategy means for road infrastructure and workplace safety. Liz Waller is Head of Road Safety at Transurban, the operator of many private roads.
Thank you, Narelle, and it's a pleasure to be here, everybody. So I'm just going to open up some notes so that I can give you a bit of background on where I think that industry has an opportunity with the strategy. I think it really is understanding what can we really realistically respond to amongst those many priorities. And at Transurban, we've embedded the safe system approach, and so we respond to just about everything on that list there, with excluding really regional road safety and remote road safety because that's not where we operate our roads. But the obvious ones are in the infrastructure planning and investment and heavy vehicle safety, and particularly in the construction sector, where we build huge infrastructure, as you will see in Melbourne and in Sydney at the moment, and tunnelling. And so there's lots of trucks that are making movements through urban areas. And in doing that, we participate on the CLOCS-A working group, which has also been identified in the strategy. But we've got an ability to influence a whole range of things, and that includes vehicle purchase choices and influencing the sorts of behaviours that we see on our network and the broader network, because we collect huge amounts of data on crashes. And these sorts of technologies that can be used to influence behaviours are variable speed limit signs, and also how we can network and communicate with our large customer base who use not just our roads, but obviously the broader network. The other thing industry has an opportunity with is to invest in research and sponsor programs that improve the safety outcomes for other priority areas. And so that could be our most vulnerable and disadvantaged children, disadvantaged including children, Aboriginal and Indigenous youth, and older people and motorcyclists. And we're certainly doing that in our partnership with Neuroscience Research Australia at the Road Safety Centre that we sponsored there. But what I really wanted to talk about was this absolute ability to address the priority of workplace road safety. The strategy has a focus on people using vehicles as a workplace, and infrastructure obviously has a really important role in building great infrastructure so that people can get from their home through their workday and home again safely. And that's everybody, from the heavy vehicle sector through to those who are responding to incidents and emergencies, including police, ambulance and fire, as well as our own incident response teams that we have at Transurban. But there are many challenges for those who work on the road, and that's really what I wanted to talk about. So these are very complex traffic situations. They involve network operations and the customer experience, but that really impact the safety. And it's those driver decision making and the behaviour that happens around work zones that's a real issue for us and for industry and those who operate roads generally. And there's not a great lot of data around road worker incidents and trauma. In fact, the CARS-Q fact sheet, which is a couple of years old now, does provide some insights on work zone fatalities and serious injuries, but that's for all road users, and it's limited to fatal and serious injury data, and not so much the near misses that we actually see day to day for the people who are responding to incidents or undertaking maintenance on the network. We're currently working with the traffic management sector through a Roads Australia working group to improve the safety of those that work on the roads. And this because of the enormous risk, and it's something that we can all do to work towards eliminating the risk for those people. And the strategy is an example of the way that they've identified the funding of roads and how we could influence procurement practices so that actually becomes above the line when we're procuring those big projects or any project for that matter. The other thing, and it goes to Mick's point, is bringing forward automated enforcement at work sites. And I think that that's something that could have a really big impact. And it's something that we have called for in almost every submission on road safety that we've made at both state and federal level. So apart from, and I'll keep the theme about work zone safety or the road as a workplace going, but in terms of the enabling actions, I was really interested in the data and research and building capacity, and also the CABS area, because we've done quite a bit of work in that area, and I think there's a great role for industry to be engaged there. Emerging data, and it's often in real time, is becoming more easily available, and this is coming from connected vehicles and they're newer vehicles. So things like autonomous emergency braking and steering assist technologies in cars are providing amazing insights to near misses. So we're looking at things before they actually become a crash. And so I think there's an opportunity to build this data into our processes of problem identification, understanding, monitoring of what's happening on the network, and also evaluation of those measures that we're putting in place. And this can certainly support and contribute to those leading indicators that are now been outlined in the strategy, which I think is really good. So we're not just relying on those lagging indicators, which can take a lot of time for us to get our heads around. And there's certainly a significant opportunity to use this data to understand better the driver behaviour, and particularly those that don't comply with traffic management and put those road workers at risk that I was talking about earlier. So we can be looking and seeing, what are vehicles doing as they're going through reduced speed zones? What are they doing when they're in single lane, or if they're in multi-lane highways or motorways like ours, and to then look at what can we do to address this? How can we better manage these really risky situations? And of course, I think building capacity is all about innovation. We need to continually innovate to make sure that everyone does get home safely, and by eliminating people who have to work in live traffic, so somehow moving more quickly towards the connected vehicles and connected infrastructure will be key to this in the long term. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the page in the strategy that talked about how demonstrating zero can be achieved. I really like this page, and the examples that that are in there certainly resonate with the work that we do at Transurban. For instance, the partnership with Neura that I mentioned earlier around child occupant safety. We operate, as you know, really high-speed multi-lane roads, and I'm really proud that we have already achieved 91% of travel for passenger vehicles on our Australian network on 4-star or better roads. But we've got an opportunity there to collaborate and build capacity in the industry by sharing those experiences and demonstrating how we apply the SAFE system and to support the articulation of the social model. So that's Transurban and industry in a nutshell, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and so pleased to be able to be here with you today. Thanks, Narelle.
Thank you, Liz. And now I'd like our presenters to answer some of the questions that you have submitted. I think, first of all, okay, here we are, all on the screen now. First of all, a question for Richard. Richard, the social model encourages us to reach out to other sectors, yet there is a lack of recognition in the opposite direction. There's a lack of recognition of road trauma in the National Preventative Health Strategy and the Injury Prevention Strategy. How can we work to embed stronger links to the health sector?
Yeah, thanks, Narelle. I think this is a really key question because we are very siloed, unfortunately, when we start to think about these sorts of areas. And so I think for us, coming back from a road safety back into health is to really, one, highlight the cost to the health system. It's a massive cost each year that the health system has to bear because of the road traffic accidents that occur across Australia as part of that process. And, I talk about not just there, in the hospital, but you also got ambulance, you've got aeromedical retrieval that needs to go pick up these cases. You've then got people and ambulances that are delayed in getting to the cases. And then you've got within that, so as a person comes in, they're treated in the ED, they then might go to the ICU, then they go into the trauma part of it to be looked after. And this is a massive cost. This is just the initial cost of the health system. This doesn't then flow on to the follow-up with where you've got GPs dealing with the ongoing sequelae. So we need to be clear about what the cost of these are to the health system and who's involved. We also, I think, need to reach out to some really good groups. Like the surgeons have been very proactive about road safety across the board. And I think we need more of them involved because they're actually a very powerful voice when we go to government, also when we go within health. So I think we need to support that leadership and bring them into that part as part of it. And I think the ongoing costs, that health actually ignores some of those ongoing, they see the trauma part of it, but they forget about all these other people that are caught up in the system around that. So I do think that we need to reach them and engage them and try and get this embedded a little bit more in some of the health strategies. And conversely, I think health also then needs to reach out and kind of say, how can we help you? We're talking about how do we get people to hospitals? What's the safe way of getting them there? How do we do active transport around hospitals so that people can get there and be healthy as part of that process? So there's a really, I think, a strong mix around these kind of challenging spaces of us reaching out to them and health reaching out and find that common scenario where we can actually come together and meet. And I think inviting health people along to what we're talking about to hear about some of the great engineering that's going on. And I think also the other thing we need to think about is, alcohol is still a major contributor to road traffic fatalities. We see a lot of people come through EDs and we need to be thinking about those short interventions that we can do in EDs and those teachable moments. And your kind of impact of coming to a hospital is a teachable moment. And we need to maximize that from a road safety area and how we get that taken back from people, even waiting to go in and see into the ED or see doctors.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. And we've had a lot of interest in movement and place and a number of questions relating to movement and place. And so I'd just like to ask Jo, from the perspective of somebody working with communities, what can we do to get what are sort of internationally recognised as safer speeds, particularly 30 km/h limits in urban areas?
Thanks, Narelle. That's a really good question because a couple of years ago I spoke at the Adelaide Australian Road Safety Conference, and my talk was about speeds and a speed project that I'd worked on. And I was saying to a room of the conference delegates that I constantly am contacted by the community requesting lower speeds. And this seemed to be a shock, that people didn't realise that that is actually what the community do request. I think in road safety, there has often been a lot of focus on, no, they don't want speeds lowered from 100 or 110, but not that focus of in our CBD areas, they really do want lower speed limits and around school zones. I know the main street of Queanbeyan, our businesses are yelling for a reduced speed limit of 40 kilometres at the moment, but 30 kilometres would even be more ideal. So I think it's engaging with our communities and making sure that they've got a voice at this level and that we are really bringing their perspectives through to the state and federal governments to actually act on them. Narelle, I think that's really important.
And thank you for that. And I'd like to ask David a question. That's one that our attendees have put in is, how do you think that councils can be supported to implement their network safety plans, particularly councils who are in rural and remote areas?
Do that. There you go. Thanks, Narelle. Look, I fully understand the limitations of council, having worked in that for half my career. And in regional councils, rural and regional councils in particular, I think any council engineer would understand you're a bit of a jack of all trades, and you don't necessarily have the capability to develop the expertise that might be required, or even understand what is possibly out there. And I think that's the thing about the strategy, where it specifically identifies that local government needs support. They need the capacity building and they need the support, not just financially. Councils will always be needing more money. It's a huge infrastructure bill that they have to manage. But I think if we can, if the governments, and I mean that at the federal level and at the state level, can show local governments and leadership and support them to say, road safety is about this, and this is how it integrates with your community. And I think, as Joe touched on, that movement of place is a part of that conversation. You can have that conversation with your community, with your elected leaders. Then you'll start to get some momentum within local government to say, this is how we can apply road safety within our community. So I think that support needs to be a little bit bespoke, but it certainly needs to be plentiful and connecting across the spectrum. It's not just the engineers in councils, it's the town planners, it's the community services people, it's the road safety officers. So they need support to integrate road safety across the organisation. And then I think you will see, as we have in other areas of community delivery, councils will step up and absolutely make a delivery that suits their community.
Thank you, David. A question for Liz. Transurban is known for motorways to move people and freight quickly. What role can you and other road builders and operators play in improving vulnerable road user safety?
Thanks, Narelle, and thanks to whoever asked that question. There's quite a bit of work that not just Transurban does, but the motorway or freeway sort of sector, I guess. We see a lot of, going back to the gig economy, we see a lot of riders and scooter riders in our tunnels, and it's actually illegal. So we do a lot of work with those platforms, and often get involved in government roundtables or other working groups to be a contributor to those new policies and to bring research. So we've got, as I mentioned earlier, so much data that we can actually contribute to this discussion. I think too, when we're upgrading and building new infrastructure, it's important that cycling and pedestrian infrastructure is included there. And going to Sean's point of view as well, how do we, improve the safety for motorcycles or motorcyclists on that infrastructure as well. So there's an enormous amount that we can be doing, and it goes exactly to that movement in place and straight to safe systems. So our industry has very much a role to not just be looking at what we do in terms of how we generate our revenue, but what's our role, what's our social license, and how do we respond to those sustainable development goals that were mentioned earlier by one of the speakers. So in a nutshell, a lot. There's a lot we can be doing.
Thank you, Liz, and I hope that will encourage other industry organisations. A question for Sean. Sean, you mentioned that the need for a national motorcycle safety strategy. What do you think are the barriers to actually developing one? Why haven't we had one recently?
Well, I guess there's a number of things. I mean, starting at the headline level, and this has been talked about for some time, and I don't want to make the whole focus of my talk today about things that have happened in the past, but in fact, Narelle and others here were involved in the Motorcycle and Scooter Safety Summit in Canberra in 2008, 14 years ago. And this is when the national conversation started happening then. But in fact, I think 3 or 4 years after that, we used to have a Federal Motorcycle Safety Consultative Committee. That's existed in various guises, but that hasn't existed at all for the past decade. Certainly to their credit, I mean, quite a bit of the appreciation and the thanks for the achievements of the past decade, where I've seen that reduction in the fatality rate, obviously has come from a multitude of different state and territory motorcycle safety strategies, in almost all cases working quite closely with our rider organisations. So the question I ask is, particularly looking now for the next decade, about wanting to not talk about the rate that Sean's been talking about all day, but we want to see a 50% reduction in the actual number over the next decade. Then how much more could be achieved if we actually were able to bring together all that knowledge across the country, and indeed drawing information from overseas, really for a genuine best practice approach. And I think each of the states and territories, perhaps they're just, they're seeing good results locally. And I guess that's the question I was asked, is how much more we could achieve if we were to work together with a national approach over the next decade.
Richard, we had a number of questions from attendees about regional and remote road safety. One of the things that did come up was movement and place. Is there any relevance in regional and remote areas, or is this just something which is going to help in urban areas and actually not be relevant to many of the priorities in the strategy, such as Indigenous people, vehicle safety, workplace safety, remote roads?
Yeah, thanks, Narelle, and thanks for whoever's asking that. I mean, I think movement in place is important across the board. I think one of the challenges we've got in the rural and remote space is the mixed use of the environment, and thinking about the road infrastructure that we've got. So if you think about some of the cyclists that have been injured on roads, if they're, because there's no verge on some of our rural roads. I think the other thing that I didn't mention as well is we've got some disaster stuff that's happened, obviously, in a number of rural areas, which wash out roads and cause other sorts of hazards. So this movement in place stuff is an important part to think about when you go in and consult with the communities. I agree with David. I think that local councils can step up and often do. I think they are going to need a helping hand to understand what their role is and where they work. Not every local council has a road safety officer sitting in there helping them out. Not every local council has an engineer anymore. I mean, lots of them kind of do, but also are now buying in that service. So I think there's some challenges there for us in the rural space. I think the evidence part that we talked about before, I think that, we need to build that up as well so that local councils do go, this is what works in a small area. If you've got a very small population that's cost effective and we can do, as opposed to large urban centres, which might have a bit more funding. So I think all of these need to be taken into account. And that's why, again, I think the social model and thinking about systems is actually really important as you work with the local council, think about their capacity and think about who they're going to need to partner with, because often in rural areas as well, there are the businesses. Liz was talking about this before, really important to think about the commercial side of it and what they want and what they need as well. We have a lot of commercial activity in rural areas and people often forget this, and the heavy transport stuff that we were talking about before, and the stuff which Sean was talking about with motorcycles are very popular in rural areas, and a high proportion of people go through rural areas on trips, but also use them there as well. So I think we need to take all of these things into account. And that's why I think we need to talk more about rural and regional areas, which is great to see it in the plan because they're complex. And some of these very narrow approaches are not going to work because we need to take in these other factors.
I see that David wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Narelle. And I support what Richard just outlined there. And I think movement of place, and looking at the question that was posted, movement of place is an opportunity to, one, start the conversation. It is not the silver bullet. There are going to be challenges in remote and rural and regional areas, obviously, but we are all pedestrians at some point. We all live on a road somewhere. So that part of that road is a place. Movement of place, at least, is a way of changing. As an engineer, road hierarchy was all vehicle based. It was all about how to move vehicles around on different roads. This, for me, changes that focus for engineers to be putting people in the center rather than the vehicle. And sure, it's a framework only. We can make that framework what we think it needs to be at a local level.
Narelle, I might also just go to the second part of your question, which is about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders and their needs. I think they have some very specific needs that we also do need to take into account. We've got issues with vehicle access. We've got road issues. We've got licensing issues. We've got training issues that go to that. We've got ongoing kind of development sorts of issues as well. So very much, movement and place is important for them and the way that they do and their cultural significance is part of that. But we've also got system issues which create problems in rural remote areas. So trying to get a driver's license or trying to train people or in the graduated licensing part of it is also really tricky. Getting car seats to children in remote areas so that they're in and protected in cars is tough. And then when you've got to fit lots of people in cars and the car seats and the space that they take up, how do we educate people around using the right car seats and knowing that how to put them in, how to fit them properly? So it's, again, really complex. And I think that we need to have a really good, robust discussion about it. There's some really good people working in this space. But I think, like David was saying, there is no one silver bullet that's actually going to solve these problems for us. And again, the systems-based approach is really important, and engaging these communities and making sure that they have a say in what's happening and what happens in their communities is really important.
Okay, and a question for Mick. As police are off, as well as ambulance officers and so on, are often responding to very traumatic road crashes. And this has an effect on them. And do you see a role in the strategy going forward for actually increasing the resilience of people who need to respond as part of post-crash care? Do you have any comments on that?
I think the best way of the best way to tackle incidents such as PTSD and exposure to critical road trauma incidents is for us to actually achieve the ultimate goal of zero road deaths and zero fatalities. What better way than to eliminate exposure to it in the first place? And that's certainly my comments that touched on police unions and other emergency services unions. Those organisations expend tremendous amount of resources in providing welfare to police members and other emergency members that are affected by traumatic incidents. So that's why it's so critical that it's not just the departments, the police departments, etc., that buy into this, but it's all those agencies on the periphery have to buy into the national strategy and do their best. It's much better for a police union might be able to provide some support and some advice to a police officer's family about what's the best car to buy for their novice driver. That's much better than having to provide member welfare.
I'm conscious that we have many, many questions, and we certainly won't be able to get through them all, but thank you for asking them. And some of our speakers are actually taking on those questions. And what I suppose I'd like to finish up with a question for Jo, which is that one of our attendees has noted that the movement of place concept seems to be largely being applied to adults, perhaps. And how can it be used, particularly in local areas, to improve the safety for children and particularly safe routes to school, in addition to actually just having the correct speed limits outside the school?
Narelle, school zones is such a fantastic question. As a road safety officer, I reckon I spend a good 50% of my job working with schools. And at the moment, we have over 40% of New South Wales government's budget of building new schools happening in my LGA. So it is a massive task that we have in promoting school zone safety. And I hear from parents almost daily, weekly, that this is a priority for them. And therefore, I think it is massively important that school zone safety isn't just around exactly that school. And there are these set guidelines, and we have speed limits at the moment, and some wonderful programs like flashing lights and dragon's teeth that warn of 40 kilometres and you're coming into a school area, but all of a sudden a metre outside of that, it's 50 kilometres, 60 kilometres and above, and there's still families and schools operating in that area. There is certainly a lot of work to do in this area. It is your local communities. A lot of your PNCs are very engaged. A lot of your parents are very engaged, and they really care about this issue. So certainly movement in place, working with your local governments and your local schools could actually get some really good wins on the board.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's probably all the time we've got for questions. So we'll perhaps go to our, thanks Gemma for our next slide. And I'd like to thank our presenters and attendees. I'd particularly like to thank Gemma and Cara from the college for doing all of the work to make things happen smoothly. And let's continue our conversation, and certainly we'll be sending out the recording to those of you who registered and to others who may have registered but weren't able to come today. So again, thank you to everybody. And I think it's been a very worthwhile and interesting conversation. Thank you again.